can't make me doubt it. You can't make me doubt it. You can't make me doubt it in my heart. Well, you can't make me doubt it. You can't make me doubt it. You can't make me doubt it in my heart. I prayed it down from heaven. I prayed it down from heaven. Prayed it down from heaven in my heart. I prayed it down from heaven. I prayed it down from heaven. Prayed it down from heaven in my heart. Well, you can't make me doubt it.
Well, you can't make me doubt that Sarah is cringing heavily right now. So there's a lot of things that nobody's going to be able to make me doubt. That's one of them. Thanks for once again choosing Presby Girls as you're listening for the day. Please be sure to keep your tray table in its upright position during takeoff, and please remain seated with your seatbelt fastened with the seatbelt sign while the seatbelt sign is on. That was supposed to be a bit, and it flopped, but I'm just going to go with it. Anywho, thanks for joining us once again. Today we are here to extol the virtues of being, ordinary and normal. So if you're wondering why it's been 4 months since our last show, as per usual time slot, well, the two of us needed someone normal to talk to, and finding one in the NAPARC world took us this long. So one of us also has been busy writing talks for women's retreats, and she's going to hate me for bringing it up, but I'm very proud, so I have to mention it. Obviously, it wasn't me. No one wants to hear me talk at a retreat. I always love talking anyway. Everyone's always heard what I have to say about anything. So we don't need to really guess who that might be. One day I wanted her to give the retreat talk on the show, and she was like, no, I'm not going to do that. So maybe we've been spared, or maybe we're being prevented from some good content, but I'm sure it'll leak its way in at some point. Anywho, the reason we decided to have this show in the first place, as I said, was to answer the question, why is everyone being so weird all the time? To that we say, we have no idea. Good night. Although, the reality is a lot of what Sarah and I have talked about recently, both on and off Presby Girls, is how neglected the concept of ordinariness is in the life of the believer, and how important it is for Christians to see value in their everyday lives, especially on the internet, but also in real life. There's a lot of talk about nation building, political influence, culture shaping, which are all, noble things, but arguably the people who make up the heart and soul of Christian churches, normal folks, are really not being benefited by this. And I think even those people who are motivated by a grand vision sometimes leave the idea of ordinary faithfulness behind. And so we're going to talk more about that. We've got a great guest, at least I think so. You can tell me what you think by the end of the show, but I am having high hopes for this. I'm going to let Sarah do the bio and introduce our guest.
Okay, Zoe. So we have, and you're going to have to tell me how to pronounce your last name. Is it Hasler or Hasler?
It is Hasler.
Hasler. Okay, I was thrown by the single S, but we have
It's
Robert. I'm sure. Robert Hasler. And I asked him to send me a bio so that I could correctly introduce him. And the first sentence, y'all just endeared this man to me. He said, Robert is a proud son of the PCA. I love that. I love that. Anyway, he is a graduate of Hillsdale College. We'll let him pass as a Grove City Collegiate alumni.
I went to public college.
Hillsdale College and Covenant Theological Seminary. He currently serves as the pastoral intern at Christ Presbyterian Church in Burke, Virginia, and as a chaplain candidate in the U.S. Army Reserve. He lives in Northern Virginia with his wife, Kirsten, and their 3 boys. So welcome on the show, Robert. And I have to ask, how old are your boys?
I have a 6-year-old, a 3-year-old, and about an 18-month-old. So it's pretty crazy. All boys. So it's a pretty hectic household, but it's a lot of fun.
Nice.
Yeah, I would say that's about, we have 3 boys and 1 girl. And it is wild, lots of dinosaurs, lots of Legos, lots of things that can be used as swords. So sticks everywhere and complete chaos.
Definitely. Yeah, when I joined the Army, it everything became Army related. So we've got Nerf gun wars going on all the time. We're building
Oh,
machine
yes.
gun nests. It's pretty crazy over here, but it's a lot of fun.
You find the Nerf gun bullets like in all sorts of
Oh,
places
everywhere.
between couch
They pop up
cushions and
everywhere. My number
bookshelves.
one fear right now is that we live in a townhome that has like air conditioning vents on their floors, and I kind of wonder how many Nerf gun bullets
You don't want to
in
know.
my air conditioning unit right now. So
Okay, so we're going to ask you a few more questions. We're going to follow up with you about that. But what I want to do is read this post that you made probably about 2 or 3 months ago. Well, that was back in January, so that was more like 3 or 4 months ago. This is, life
going
moves
fast.
fast. Okay, so it resonated with a lot of people, and it's kind of at the heart of what we want to talk to today. So for those of you who are not on X or Twitter or whatever we're supposed to call it, and who can't see the screen, I'm just going to read this real quick, and then we're going to delve into this topic. So Robert says, I was at a pastor's retreat and was talking to a prominent pastor in the PCA. It came up that I went to Hillsdale. Hillsdale, huh? And you didn't swim the Tiber. I told him it never even crossed my mind for 2 reasons. 1, the costly discipleship of my parents. No travel sports that kept us from the Lord's Day worship. Mom and Dad quietly served the church for decades in behind-the-scenes roles, regular family meals, and worship throughout the week. My parents also prioritized hospitality. We attended the wedding of our pest control guy's son. I came home one summer and my bedroom furniture was gone because they had given it away to the woman who helped my mother clean the house. The point is this. I never once doubted how serious my parents took their faith, and the implicit charge was to take my faith seriously too. Number 2, the ordinary means of grace ministry of my home church. While all my friends and neighbors went to the local mega churches, this was the Dallas-Fort Worth suburbs, there were several, my family went to the little PCA church meeting in my elementary school. We sang hymns and a couple carefully selected contemporary songs. We didn't shy away from being Presbyterian or Reformed. The word was central. I sat under excellent expository preaching. I was taught the Westminster Standards. The only program we had was Sunday school, which was always taught by an officer, even when I was a small child. The men of the church poured into me weekly. They answered my questions. When I left for college, they brought me up before the congregation and prayed for me. I say all of this not to brag about my parents or my home church, though I hold an immense amount of respect and pride for them. You should. But I say all this to point out that the solutions we are looking for are so often more simpler than we realize. Why do young men abandon the Protestant church? Maybe because too many Protestant churches have abandoned our distinctives: the ordinary means of grace, family worship, discipleship, the beauty of and comfort of our doctrines. So anyway, that is the post that went a little bit viral and got a lot of people's attention. And a lot of, I would say, lay people like me who are thinking, well, yeah, exactly. Why are young men abandoning the Protestant church? Why are young men abandoning the church in general? I mean, I think we have numbers of young men who are actually, there's more young men attending church nowadays, but we are seeing just a frustration and a bunch of schismatics, especially in the Reformed-ish section of the church right now. And your first 2 points, the costly discipleship of your parents and the discipleship of your church, being a normal church, doing normal things, not flashy things. But I wanted to follow up with this and just let you expound a little bit more about this. I mean, we heard a little bit about what your parents did. So can you give me, a short description of what was your childhood like growing up? When you say like family worship, was your dad sitting there with the Matthew Henry commentary expositing for 45 minutes a night, or, what did it look like?
Yeah. So kind of this is what I remember a lot from my childhood when it came to the way that my parents discipled me and my sister. So my dad, I should say this way. My mom was really the theologian in residence of our house. She was valedictorian of her high school, very well educated, very well read. she had this kind of propensity to do this thing where she would go to, I think, the pastor or an elder and ask for book recommendations. And then she would probably get recommended something from Crossway or, Ligonier or something like that. And I think what she did is she would get the book and then she would look at the footnotes and then she would go find the books of that the authors were citing, which was
primary sources.
Yeah, exactly. Like the primary sources. And I remember going to, the Christian bookstore to pick up, Tozer and Spurgeon and, Puritans. And that's what that's what my mom read. And so when I say, family worship throughout the week, a lot of those were my mom and I both being sort of early birds, waking up early before school, coming down and just sitting at the kitchen table together and reading the Bible together. Or sometimes just, me doing my study and her doing her study. And then while we ate breakfast, talk about what we were reading, whether that was in the Word or if it was a theologian or something like that. During the week, in terms of coming together as a family, really what it was is we always had family meals. I mean, my parents really prioritized, we were going to sit down as a family and we're going to eat dinner as much as we can. Now, as my sister and I got older and we had more commitments like sports and things like that, it became a little bit harder to do that every day of the week. But whenever we could, that's what we did. And a lot of it was geared around the conversation was, what are you guys studying in school? We went to a classical Christian school. So, a lot of times it had to do something with the Bible or, something in theology. And usually our family would just sit and talk about those kind of things. A lot of Sundays were sitting around the kitchen table, talking about the sermon, talking about, what did we hear in worship, talking about that, and then praying together as a family. So that was really what we did a lot of time, and I think family worship, I tell people this a lot. Family worship can sound really intimidating because it's like, okay, I got to get the right stuff. I got to get the material. I got to prepare a lesson. But so much of it can just be like, what did you guys get out of the worship service today? And talking about that on a Sunday. Or, I got this great little resource from, I think it's from Reformation Heritage called the Family Worship Bible. And it kind of gives you like a summary of each chapter in the Bible. And so I kind of can just flip through that and be ready to sit down and talk with my kids. And, I have a 6-year-old, a 3-year-old, and an 18-month-old. With my 6-year-old, I'm kind of just trying to see if he'll like pick up on some basic stuff, right? My 3-year-old, I'm just sort of, getting him accommodated to the idea of like, we are in the Bible and we pray. And then, my 18-month-old, like just, he's here. Like, it's kind of, you're just doing that kind of stuff.
Exposure therapy is very legitimate at this point in like a child's life.
Exactly. So when I think about my parents and what they were doing, I try to model that a lot, which is, just very ordinary, very simple. It doesn't have to be a big thing. But really just emphasizing like, as a family, this is what we do. We spend time in the Word together and we pray together.
How old were you, when you were talking about your mom and you getting up early in the morning and sitting there and reading? Were you reading like primary sources with her, or were you reading your Bible? I mean, like, what was the age there?
I mean, it's as early as I can remember. I mean, honestly, I don't really remember a time when I wasn't doing that. And I've always been kind of that kind of nerdy academic kid. So like my mom definitely cultivated that. There's no doubt about it. But I spent a lot of time in the Word. I went through a heavy apologetics phase. And so I was reading a lot of like Precept stuff. And so I would talk about that with her. I went to a classical Christian school and I started my sophomore year. And that was really when you started going through, the kids in the classes really started having the Calvinism versus Arminianism debate, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
And so I felt kind of, I knew the stuff, but I didn't really understand, the full arguments. I wanted more. That's really what I wanted. So my mom, I think she basically was like, whatever you want, like, we'll get it for you. So I was just reading R.C. Sproul, and then I was reading who R.C. Sproul was recommending, and I was just reading that kind of stuff constantly. When I got a little bit older, like when I was a senior, that was really when I started wanting to say, okay, well, what is the other side saying? And so my mom did a really good job of sort of cultivating that in a very careful and mature way.
Yes.
Where I could read something, I think one of the books that came out that was really big, was a book by, I think he was sort of like an atheist type who was sort of poking holes in the Jesus narrative. And so that was like the #1 selling book of the year or something like that. Well, I went and picked that up from Barnes and Noble and I read it. And then my mom organized a meeting for me to sit down with one of our elders. And I talked about it with him. And then he gave me more resources. And then I was reading those. So she just kind of was like, looked for where the Holy Spirit was really working in my heart and the things that were interesting to me. And then she just was like, I'll just supply that and I'll do that and cultivate it. So that was really what I remember a lot. And we did that. I mean, I did that as long as I can remember.
That's really pretty amazing. And something that Sarah and I talk about a lot just personally is how important it is for, you know, the fathers, of course, to have a good solid backbone for just the doctrinal foundation of the family or like the Christian life foundation, but, you know, kind of almost to an equal degree how mothers and wives should be theologically trained and theologically grounded, because a lot of your exposure in life is to your mom, especially if you're a homeschool kid like me. Mm-hmm. And so if you have good, well-trained, theologically sound moms who kind of know what is right, doctrinally speaking, I just can't laud that enough as an example, because you really only hear it from a few people. But I like to hear sometimes people say, well, I don't like to hear it, but I do hear it. It's like women shouldn't read theology, like that's not really their department. And, you know, to a certain extent, you know, I'm very pro male eldership, but I just had to get that in there. Is like, it sounds like it's very important that, you know, mothers of children who go on to become ministers themselves one day are theologically grounded. So I just love to hear that. I think that's awesome.
Yeah. You know, I when I think about my mom, I think of, you know, Augustine's mom and the way that she really prayed for her son and, you know, really guided him and steered him in the faith. I think, you know, my dad was a very successful businessman. And what I really remember from him was he was such a good discipler of, this is how this works in the real world. Like being a Christian man who was in this very competitive, very high stakes sort of corporate atmosphere, and how to be a faithful Christian in that place. I'm in those spaces. And so I remember just long conversations, just sitting outside with my dad, talking about what that was like. And, you know, how do you do those kind of things? And how do you navigate those things? And he was just full of this wisdom that he had gained over years of being in those places. And so, you know, my dad was really the practical, this is how you live it out in the real world, as a Christian man, taking care of your family, being a witness in the workplace. So that's what he was. And I know I still call him all the time to get advice about that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So you had your mom with the theoretical, this is how everything lines up, sort of in a theological Excel sheet. And your dad is like, okay, and this is how you actually use it.
Right.
This is, which means that, I mean, not only, you know, I think people can be impressed by, the theological prowess of your mom. But I'm actually very impressed with the availability, because I think that is one key, very normal thing that a lot of families neglect, is you cannot overschedule your family to the point where you just aren't around to have long conversations with your kids. I mean, your kids are not going to say, hey, Dad, can I talk with you at 5:30 on a Thursday afternoon?
Right.
Like, you just got to be there. And sometimes, you know, sometimes things come up, obviously, but if you're so busy and so scheduled that you never have one-on-one time with your kids, or they just don't feel comfortable coming and asking you what they know is going to be a 2-hour conversation, then you don't get to have those. You will never have those. So
absolutely,
that's really neat to hear. And I'm taking notes from your mother. That's really cool. And you talk about your parents. You also talk about your church. It sounds like your elders and the men in your church really were involved and very much took you under their wing and poured a lot of time and energy into your discipleship as well. Would you say that?
Absolutely. Yeah. One of my favorite stories about my elders growing up was so I went off to Hillsdale, and that's where I met my wife, Kirsten. when we got engaged. She's from the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. That's where her family is from. So that's where we got married. Now, being from Texas, like, I don't think I had been like that north of Arkansas at that point in my life. So when I said, hey, I'm getting married in the UP, like my grandfather asked if he needed a passport. Like, that's how like how different world that was for a lot of us. And so the way that the elders tell the story, one of the elders tells the story, is that they were basically like, we need to check on what's going on with Robert. And so I actually, at my wedding in the UP, so I had been out of this church, this was my home church, but I've been in college for 4 years. At the wedding of my UP, 3 elders and their wives came to my wedding in the UP and had a table and stayed for the, went to the wedding and then stayed for the reception and everything. So, that's kind of how involved they were in my life. And that was totally normal. That wasn't a weird thing that they came. Like, that's of course what they would do.
They were just making sure you weren't going Dutch.
Exactly. Well, yeah, exactly. I think it was definitely a sort of like, what's going on here? But they approved. They said that the sermon was very, the sermon that was delivered at the wedding was very good theology. So, so that's what they were like. I think one thing that really struck me, even as a kid, and especially now, when I look back on it as somebody who's as somebody who's in ministry right now, I think a lot of churches, not just PCA churches, but all kinds of evangelical Protestant kind of churches, the pastor really becomes kind of like a CEO, and so they're kind of like the one in charge, and then they've kind of got their VPs, the elders or whatever, and that's kind of how the church feels like it's structured, right? Mm-hmm. The church that I grew up in, the more I reflect on it, that's just not the way it was. Like Pastor B, who was my pastor, Pastor Boxman, he was the preacher and he was the teacher, and that was very clear that was his responsibility. But in terms of the governing of the church, that was a session-wide thing. Yes. And it felt very clear that was the case. And so, and I think it was one thing that I talk about a lot, that a lot of people tell me is quite, unique. And I kind of thought it was normal. I don't know if it was organized this way. I don't know if this was like a internal session policy, but every Sunday school I had growing up was taught by an officer, whether it was a deacon or an elder. Yeah. And so
I noticed that as well.
Just being in Sunday school with those men, I was able to develop relationships with them because I was sitting under their teaching and listening to them and asking them questions. And so, they were just part of the church. They were leading the church. They had an vested interest in those things that were going on. And as somebody who was a communicant member at age 9, like, they really saw it as their job was to shepherd me. And it didn't matter that I was a 9-year-old kid. And so they were part of my life. And I have the utmost respect for them and what they were doing, because when you go out into the world and you visit other churches and you see other churches, and sometimes you're like, oh, this is just not the way it is all the time.
Yeah, I think in a lot of churches, it's, people want to see kids and they want to see a church full of kids and full of children running around. But they don't want to be on the volunteer list to take care of those children. I mean, in the PCA, we have membership vows. We have vows when the kids are baptized and the congregation takes those. And at least in our church right now, where we're at, they do a fantastic job of keeping those vows. And it's something that I have never seen done. Done well. I mean, it's not that I've ever seen it not done well. It's just I've never even seen it attempted. So like you're saying, well, I thought this was normal, and we got here and we're like, really? Wow. It makes such a difference. And you were talking about the hierarchy. My husband is the associate pastor here, but there's a senior and an associate pastor at our church, and then a group of elders, a group of deacons, and it does not feel like the senior and the associate are the CEOs or the top dogs. Like, I feel very much on the sidelines. like Sean, he teaches and he preaches, and that's his role. But it is definitely not like our elders do a bunch of governing. Our deacons are amazing. They do, a buttload of work. Holy cow. And so you feel much more secondary to them. You feel secondary to the people, just normal people in the congregation who are amazing. You think, we just don't even deserve to, be here and be pastor and pastor's wife. It's such a blessing. So that was a good observation. And then after you graduated from Hillsdale, I assume you went straight to Covenant, or when did the Army thing come in?
No. So what happened was, I went to Hillsdale thinking that I was going to follow my dad into banking. That was the plan. And so I studied finance at Hillsdale. I always wanted to study finance. That was kind of the plan. But I loved what I was learning at my classical Christian school. And so I was like, oh, I can go to Hillsdale and study finance and then also get to do all this.
The classical stuff too. Cool
classical stuff. So that's how I ended up there. I had a college counselor at my high school who her son had gone to Hillsdale. So that's how I heard about it and went there. It was really fun being from Texas. Nobody knew what Hillsdale was.
Oh yeah.
So I had a bunch of parents of my classmates like, oh, Hillsdale, is that an Ivy League school? And I'd be like, yeah, it is an Ivy League school. Exactly right. So I talked myself up a little bit.
Hillsdale is Yale is the Hillsdale of the East.
That's what we like to say. So I went up to Hillsdale to study finance, and then that was the plan. And then kind of what happened was I joined a fraternity, and I sort of had my prodigal years, and my grades were just kind of tanking. By God's grace, that's when I met my now wife. I think when I met my wife, my sophomore year, I had already put on the freshman 65. And I think I had a 2.1 GPA. Like my social fraternity said my grades were too low to join. That's kind of where we were at. So,
wow.
Then I met my wife, and then within a semester of meeting her and starting to date her, I got back into shape, and I made the dean's list. I remember coming home, and my mom basically having met her was basically like, you got to marry her. And I was like, yes, ma'am. So that's kind of what happened. So by the time my senior years come around, I'd sort of made a turn, but my grades just weren't really good enough to try to get the jobs that I was really hoping to get. And so the interviews that I was doing with some different banks. And everything felt like this is just not right. Like I was engaged at the time, and the hours that they were asking. I remember going on a tour of one bank, and they were like, this is the floor that that you would be working on, and here are the beds that we've built underneath the desks where you can sleep when it's a late night. And I just remember being like, I don't think this is going to work. So I decided kind of at the last minute that was not the path I was going to take, which then became like, well, what am I going to do?
Right.
And so my wife had already graduated. She was a year before me. And her career, she kind of started working in politics. That was what she ended up doing. And so DC just kind of became sort of a natural place for us to go, because she could find a job in politics pretty quickly. And then Hillsdale sends a ton of alums out to DC. And so my plan was I'll just start networking with alums and see if I can just find something that I can do. And so I ended up doing nonprofit accounting for a year. That was kind of the way that's the only time I've ever really used my degree. And then after a year of doing that, I got a call from someone who kind of became a mentor to me to come back and work for Hillsdale and to run academic programming in DC, which was a program that I had done while I was a student there. And so I kind of moved from finance and accounting into academic programming. And great thing about Hillsdale being the way it is, I was doing kind of professional counseling. And then what would end up happening a lot is that I would end up doing sort of pastoral counseling in some capacity. So I was, doing interview. I always remember this. I would be doing interview practice with a guy who's looking for an internship, and you would realize, oh, he can't make eye contact with me. And so then so then it becomes well, what's going on here? Something deeper is going on. And so I was able to do that with a couple guys that had gone through the program, whereas very quickly we were not doing professional counseling. We were talking about faith and, things that were going on in your life. And I just remember I would come home from doing that, and I would talk to my wife about it, and she would be like, that's what you need to do. That's your gifting. That's your call. So she was kind of the first external call that I got. And And then we were also attending a PCA church at the time. I called my pastor, say, hey, can we go get lunch? And as I'm walking into the restaurant to sit down, he's like, just so we're very clear, I know what this meeting is about. You're thinking about ministry. I think you need to do it. And I was like, okay, well,
wow,
sounds good.
Wow.
That's all very helpful. And so that's when I started kind of making that move. So I started seminary, actually in DC. I was able to start online with Covenant and kind of do their hybrid version where you would take classes online and then go to campus. And was doing that, still working at Hillsdale. And then what ended up happening was we were planning to move to St. Louis because I was like, I really want to go ministry full time. Like I want to be in ministry, doing seminary. Like I'm ready to make the jump. And my wife, we were looking in St. Louis constantly for something, and we just couldn't find anything that worked. And it was like, how is this going to work? What are we going to do? And my wife, being, the resourceful person that she is, went to the PCA job board. First thing on the list was, hey, there's a ministry in DC called Ministry to State with Mission to North America. And they do discipleship ministry to people on Capitol Hill. I think you'd be great at that. And I was like, oh, okay. And I sent in a resume, and then I got a call from Chuck, and I worked for Ministry to State for about 2.5 years. And so that's how I started into ministry. So that was kind of the way that worked from Hillsdale all the way through seminary and then into ministry.
Okay. And it sounds like despite all the different exposures you had, you're still oriented towards like classical, traditional Protestantism, which is kind of like the catalyst for your thread in the first place. And something that's been a hot topic of conversation is, why are people going Anglican, going Catholic, going Eastern Orthodox, like especially young men? And it's just very interesting. It sounds like your foundational background, being part of a normal, ordinary PCA church, kind of stayed with you even through all that different experience and exposure, which is really interesting. And so I know Sarah had a few things that she wanted to talk about regarding just, your take on young men, Protestants, and just like that sort of thing. So Sarah, I'm not sure exactly what your specific question was, but I just think that's really cool that there was that through line all the way. It seems like to me, just based on your telling your story, that there are just some foundations that you never let go of, which I think is really cool.
Well, absolutely. I think one of my follow-up questions was going to be in college. Mm-hmm. And when you all had the time in DC and had the time in St. Louis, were you watching this phenomenon happen with other young men? Like wanting something, is it the want of something serious and respectable, and coming from a lot of big box churches, just getting that religion is a bunch of like feelings oriented type of thing? And you look at, something like Rome, which is intimidating and feels very somber and grave and like you're taking something seriously, even if it is, theologically bankrupt. I mean, is that what you were seeing?
Yeah. The interesting thing about Hillsdale is, I think a lot of people that go to Hillsdale who come Protestant, who come to Hillsdale being Protestant, if you're coming from a sort of big box church, like you said, kind of non-denominational, that world, I think what happens is you come to Hillsdale and you start reading, the classics, and you start reading Augustine, and you start reading Aquinas, and I think it's very easy to think, oh my gosh, I love all this stuff, and in order to have access to it, I must become Catholic because that's the Catholic heritage. It's kind of funny. Like I grew up when I think about the time when I was growing up at my church and in my family, that was sort of like the peak of Young, Restless, Reformed. All of my buddies were reading Driscoll and Piper, and like, praise God that my mom was like, no, you're going to get Table Talk and R.C. Sproul. Yeah. And so that's what I read. And, you read R.C. Sproul, and I remember a video that just is seared into my brain where it's like R.C. Sproul is like the top 5 Reformed theologians of all time. It's like number 1, Augustine. Like, it's just kind of like, I just sort of assumed that was part of my heritage. Like all of that belonged to me too. And so like when I went to Hillsdale and I picked up Augustine, City of God for the first time in a Western Heritage class, I was like, oh yeah, like I get all this. Like I'm right there.
Mom, can we have Mark Driscoll? We have Mark Driscoll at home.
Yeah, exactly.
It's Table Talk.
Exactly. So, I mean, just like praise God in those, like those little decisions, like the way, what you curate for your kids, like has massive implications. But I think that was kind of what happened at Hillsdale. Is I never really was tempted by that sort of, prospect of getting this intellectual heritage, because I already felt like I had it.
Yes. And what a great reminder for families who are looking at, different kind of education options, or who are thinking about, stuff for their family, to really realize that, your kids are probably going to come into contact with this at some point. Right. And like you said, you thought it was, well, this is our tradition. Like, right. Yeah, you get into Aquinas and some of his stuff is wacky and some of it's really great. Augustine, this is my heritage. This doesn't have to be something that is completely separate.
Right, exactly. Now, when I came to DC, one of the things that is very, I think, clear when you come to DC, people think of DC as sort of like this godless pagan place, but there's evangelical Christian ministries all over the place. Like, you can go to Capitol Hill. They have a thing called the Ministry Night or something like that. And they basically invite all the ministries that are 2 people on Capitol Hill to set up a booth, and new interns and new staff members can come through and get connected. There's just tables after table after table. But I think something that I picked up, especially as somebody who then began in ministry for a PCA ministry on Capitol Hill, this difference between the church as this sort of heavenly institution with God-given ordained means of doing worship, thinking of church that way versus, church as a movement. I think you really see in the sort of evangelical space, this shift of the church as a movement. And the problem with thinking of church as a movement is that movements tend to be very reactionary, and they tend to be tied to very specific cultural moments.
Or people.
Right.
Yeah. And so, because it's so tied to that, kind of everything that the church as a movement does, whether it's what you're doing for your preaching series or what you're doing, for your programs, they all become strategies. They don't become things that God commands you to do in worship, but they become strategies. And so if you feel like a strategy isn't working, then you change it. And so I think what we see a lot of times in like sermon series, for example. So like still a lot of even, big, movement churches will have a Sunday service, and they'll have a preaching as, part of that service. Mm-hmm. Well, if you feel like, going verse by verse through a book really isn't getting what we want done, it's not really the right strategy. It's not very hard to imagine like how you get to this point where you're like, well, we're going to do a series on the gospel themes of Pixar movies. Like, if everything's a strategy just aimed at like getting the product sold, then all of these things sort of are constantly in churn. And I think really like what ends up happening is you kind of like start asking like 3 questions, right? Is the movement model of church all that biblical? I think like these are the kind of questions we need to be asking. Is the movement church all that biblical? Is it really more effective than the ordinary means of grace? I think you can look at the evidence. I don't know if it is. And then like what happens to a movement church when like the idea of a movement is no longer culturally sound? Yes. I think that's what we're seeing right now with young men, is that, especially young men, but I think it's true of all young people, right? They've grown up in a culture where things are just changing constantly.
And right? They need something stable.
Yeah, and they go away. And so
you look at things like the Catholic Church, you look at things that are old, that seem ancient, that seem like they have not changed, and they're stable. And you think, oh, well, these people have it figured out. Whereas, our Protestant traditions, like you said, we actually have that too. We just seem to be slightly embarrassed of them, or just think that they're useless. If I could write a book about how many times a misunderstanding or a misapplication of the mission of the church is the root cause for so many things wrong with everything, it would be a very long book. I think my husband and I were talking one day, and he's like, the easiest way to put it is if what is the mission of the church? What is the job that no one else will do if the church doesn't do it?
Absolutely.
What job is no one else? No one else is going to pick up this mantle. if we don't do it. And that when you think about that, suddenly things become very basic and very clear, very Great Commission oriented, the gathering and perfecting of the saints, as our confession puts it. That sounds like what your little church was doing. And it's something that a lot of our churches, even in our own denomination, but, just in Protestantism in general, need to get back to.
Absolutely. No, I would totally agree. I mean, I think, just for a plug for Christ Presbyterian Church here in Burke, one thing that Porter does very well, he's the pastor who planted the church and is the lead pastor right now. He really leans into the historic tradition of Presbyterianism, Reformed churches, and really just like sort of the Christian church, the small C Catholic church in general. And so like he is big on reminding people, like when we sing a hymn, he'll bring out the point, like, the original hymn, was written in year 800. Like Christians have been singing this for years. And I think we've seen a lot of positive reactions to that from people who are like, I really like to know that I'm in a church that does things that Christians have been doing for years and will continue to do for years to come. I think that's one thing about these sort of like movement churches is you can spend a lifetime in those kind of churches, and you've basically been in 3 different kinds of churches. And so you're asking, like, what am I handing off to my kids here? If you're in an ordinary means of grace Presbyterian church, you can be pretty confident that like what we do here is what you're going to be doing, and then what your kids are going to be doing, and then what your grandkids are going to be doing. There's something like really special about that.
How important, and obviously I think this is really important, so this is a dumb question, but is connecting the tenets of our Reformed faith, not just back to Calvin, not just back to Luther, but taking it and connecting it back through the entirety of church history back to the apostolic church. Because a lot of what I see in the Reformed church is, okay, we're the closest to the apostolic church, and then there's this like 1300 year gap, and then we're right again.
Right.
You can't lose 1200 years of history and without a remnant of the true church and without faithfulness. And it's there, and it's easy to connect the dots back through it. I'm doing it with my 7 and 9-year-old boys who are, they're getting it. They're like, oh yeah, this and this and this, and this is the Catholic Church, but this is what they believed. And then this council and then this council. And okay, this is when they steer off. And, it's so, I mean, your thoughts on that? Obviously I think it's important, but.
Yeah, I know. I think it's really important. I think, for Presbyterians, it's important to go to Acts 15 and be like, well, what is this? This is a Presbyterian meeting. Like there's like something legitimate about looking at those kind of things in scripture and be like, okay, that's what we do. Like we are very much in line with what's going on in scripture. And that shouldn't surprise us at all, because that was the whole Reformers' vision, was to, return back to a more a way of doing church that was grounded in sola scriptura. Like, what does the Bible tell us to do? That's what we're going to do. I think that's really important. I think also, it's important to not demand or expect things sort of to not develop and to grow. So for example, I think a lot of people go, well, if I read the church fathers, like I'm not going to be finding anything that really Calvin said. Well, like, of course not, because Calvin doesn't come along until much later, right? So he's building on what's come before him. He's standing on the shoulders of giants, and some church fathers are not worth reading. I would agree with that. Like there's some just kind of crazy stuff out there. Like there's no doubt about it, but there's some really great stuff. So like one book that I really recommend for people, that if they want to see like the development of doctrine throughout the church of true, good doctrine, start with Athanasius's On the Incarnation. Like, I think that's just a beautiful little book that really, I mean, you start to see stuff. I have notes in there where I'm like, that's like the genesis of penal substitutionary atonement right there. Like that's what it is. And so I would definitely recommend people to find those resources and really dive into them, just because as you said, it's really important to see the dots, to not say we're some new thing. We actually have our roots go all the way back.
Yes. And then, I think following up on that is we have roots, we have standards, we have a confession, at least in the PCA here. I'm going to pull us back from the rest of Protestantism, because it's really easy to sit in a Reformed art chair and say, oh yeah, all of you churches are doing this wrong and we've got this right.
But mega churches, it's
exactly.
oh yeah, we're very brave for criticizing mega churches. Like,
yes, I mean,
right now.
No one has ever done that before. I kind of think that the New Testament, just as a self-deprecating joke, that they definitely were Presbyterians, because Eutychus fell out of a window because they just kept talking. It's gotta be Napart. Anyway, but we have in the PCA, we have adopted standards, and we have a confession, and we have a very, very grounded historical faith, and a summary of that faith that we all ascribe to certain extents. How much of Westminster Shorter Catechism, the confession, the standards, how much of those did you actually interact with when you were a kid, teenager, growing up? I mean, because those can be very hypothetical, but then were they of any practical use to you as a child?
Yes, they were. I mean, definitely the Shorter Catechism was something that was taught in our church. I think, I think we had some kind of, program where if, you could memorize them and then you could go say them to the elders, and then like you would get like a piece of candy, which I know a lot of people are like, that's not a good way of doing it. But like, I learned the catechism.
Yes, it is.
It came in real handy, because when I went to my classical Christian school, which was started by a PCA church, we had a substitute who would always let us get out of school or get out of class early if you could answer a catechism question.
Oh my goodness.
So he would be like, what is the chief end of man? And like, I love all my Baptist brothers, but they would sit there and be like, I have no idea. Like, the chief end of man is to glorify God and enjoy him forever. See you guys, I'm out of here. Like, it definitely came into practical use. But I think, yeah, the catechism especially was something I leaned on. I also know that, like, when I was asking questions about predestination, election, I know that the elders were quick to turn to the standards and to show me those things in there, and just as sort of like, this is the kind of basic stuff. Like, you can find all kinds of books and large, texts on all these kind of things, but like, here's kind of the basic stuff. And that was really helpful, because, oftentimes what I was looking for was, I want the vernacular. I need to know what the language is, because I would be trying to have conversations with my friends who didn't believe these things. And, I'd always kind of walk away being like, I don't think I explained that very well. And like, something that's great about the standards, it sort of just gives you the vernacular. And so
yes.
you know that like what I'm saying is right. And it just gives you more confidence when you're in those settings. And so I think I was a better witness because I had the standards, and because I had the catechism sort of ingrained in me.
Yeah. Yeah. It's easy to get caught up in you have church speak, and then you have Presbyterian speak, and then you have uber Reformed Presbyterian speak. And I remember I grew up as a Baptist-ish sort of kid, and coming into the Reformed church was like learning a new language.
She's the only non-PCA Nepo baby on this show today.
Out of a whole 3 people. Yeah. And I mean, I came in via Piper. I came in via that sort of exposure to expository preaching, actually, is how I came in. I'd never heard anybody open a Bible and actually explain it. I'd heard lots of people open a Bible and talk about their hobby horse. So yeah, what do you, I'm trying to figure out how I want to ask this to be as least controversial as possible, but what do you get, the sense of, some people in our denomination, and some people just in general, I think this is a problem across all denominations, that if we emphasize the historical roots, if we emphasize these old documents with big words like therefore and thereunto and hath and doth and all of this other stuff, we're going to lose the young people. And we can't be too stodgy, and we need room for laxity. We need room, they're just different levels of adherence we should have. We should just be very free with this. And honestly, we just probably shouldn't even bring it up. We can sort of stick it in some back corner on our website that you can find and you can go read it. But to be a practical ministerial use, you know, I keep hearing we're all confessional in the PCA. And I keep thinking, well, that's a load of baloney. But but you know, you can't all ascribe in different ways to one document and then say, well, we all just believe it.
Right.
So how important do you think is adherence to our confession? And, you know, practically in ministry, how have you seen that play out?
Yeah,
Pros and cons.
That's a great question. And it's something I think about a lot, especially as somebody who was, I would say, on the more confessional side at Covenant Seminary, where I think most of my classmates were pretty comfortable with exceptions and laxity, where I was kind of more on the conservative side. Now, I never felt ostracized for that, so that's praise God for that. I think when it comes to the standards, a lot of people, not just pastors, but also people in the pews, I think often look at something like the Westminster Standards as, well, this is something that creates a barrier between us and, say, like other, you know, very good Christian people, right?
Yeah, I hear that a lot.
What was that? Sorry?
Oh, I'm so sorry. I was just thinking that same
thing.
We
hear that a lot.
I hear that a lot because not only do people think, not only do we not need to use this in our normal church life, but owning it and being comfortable with it will actually be detrimental to ministry.
Right.
Like that's what I've been hearing sometimes.
The idea being sort of like, well, if we sort of emphasize this, what we're doing is we'll be sort of saying, well, we're kind of the right ones. And, you know, those really kind and lovely Lutheran and Baptist and Anglican types, well, they're all wrong and we're the right ones. I think we kind of think that that's what our standards say, but I don't really think that that's what's going on. I think, you know, I kind of tell people the story. I've done Bible studies on Capitol Hill and I've done Bible studies in the Army. And on Capitol Hill, the ethos is we got to leave this table having everybody on the same page. We all have to agree. That's kind of the ethos of DC, is you leave meetings in agreement. And in order to do that, what you often have to do is you have to kind of find the lowest common denominator that everybody can agree on. Well, when you're doing that in kind of a Bible study setting, you know, you can't, especially if you have a Baptist and a Presbyterian and sometimes you'll have a Roman Catholic, you know, you kind of have everybody. If you want to do that, like you can't really study the Bible because you're going to have differences of opinion on all kinds of stuff.
Right.
And so you end up not really doing all that much. Now, one great thing about doing Bible study in the Army is that everybody walks into a Bible study in the Army. We're already on the same team. We're all wearing the same uniform. We're all in the same unit. We're all on the same mission. Like there's already this like baked in like brothers in arms. And so you have all this freedom to like be doing a Bible study, and like a soldier can be like, that I don't believe any of that. Like, this is what I believe. And like, this is what my church teaches on that verse or whatever. But like, it's actually this like really refreshing thing because you can actually have a back and forth and you can actually like hear what another person says. You can be like, well, that's different. I don't think I agree with that. But you can also be like, well, but there's like, maybe we disagree about that thing, but like, we're actually, you know, there's actually a lot of commonality here. It's kind of this whole idea that like, you know, strong fences make good neighbors in like a real sense. And so I tell people like, especially if you're like courting people into your church, and you know, you don't want to surprise people after they've joined the church, be like, and spring a standard on them, and be like, hey, this is what we believe. If you don't believe any of it, like you're not really with us. You actually want to be
that's not what we're advocating for.
Yeah.
I feel like a lot of people who don't necessarily agree with anything that we've said in the past 10 minutes would think that that would be our strategy. Like there's this like, hi, new visitor, here's a copy of the Shorter Catechism. You better agree with all of it.
Right. I think a lot of times if you just lean into it and you say like, this is what we are, this is what we believe, this is our heritage. I think people have a lot of grace and a lot of willingness to sort of be like, okay, maybe I'm not there right now, but I appreciate that you're open and honest about it, and you don't hide away from it, and you don't like you're not trying to spring it on me later. I think I've seen a lot of people be more willing to sort of listen and maybe change their mind on those kind of things if you actually lead with it. I think also it's a way of just sort of being being honest in those irenic conversations where you're dealing with people of different traditions, where you can actually like have some good back and forth, and figure out what you disagree on, and then also figure out what you have a lot of commonality on.
Yeah, I mean, there's just that agreement to disagree on certain things, especially across denominational lines. Within the PCA, I mean, even we're going to have to agree to disagree on some things, because there's a lot of disagreement on, you know, things like the Sabbath, on the fourth commandment, on, you know, days of creation, you know, that kind of stuff gets brought up a lot. You know, you don't have to be a jerk,
right,
to have an unflinching defense of our standards. You know, it's ordinary means of grace. It's not ordinary means of shove it down your throat. Which I mean, honestly, does get abused. I'm not going to shy away from saying that I have never met, you know, reformed cantankerous jerks. I've met my fair share of them. You know, and so it doesn't have to mean that you're a jerk, and you should not present it in that way. But I think, like what you said earlier, of having these conversations, you're direct, you're upfront with what you believe, but it's an ironic conversation. Like, I'm not going to try to string you along. I'm not going to take such advantage of your time and act like you're a child and try to dance around the subject and never address it head on. Like, at least just, you know, tell me, what do you believe? What is this specifically? You know, there are going to be obviously other opinions on this subject, but, you know, when pastors especially qualify a subject, when the subject dies the death of 1,000 qualifications because we don't want to be offensive, that to me is actually fanning the flames of young men in the Protestant church who want direct answers. And honestly, young women for that too is
true.
The young people, millennials, Gen Z. I'm not really a young person anymore. I'm the older millennial now, but
you can sneak into the party with me. I'll make sure somebody cards you.
Somebody can translate internet speak. Zoe, what in the world are they saying? But we're looking for directness, and I hate even using the word authenticity, because it gets misused.
Gets overused for sure.
Yeah, it's that.
But there's legitimacy to that, though.
Right.
But I think it's fanning the flame, because what we are seeing right now is a lot of young men who are attracted to the absolute jerks. They're attracted to the guys who are direct, but not direct in a Christian way. They're attracted to the guys that are, you know, they got these zinger one-liners. They can be really pugnacious online. They've got a lot of gotcha statements. It feels like they win a lot of conversations, not because they're academically erudite or theologically correct, but they really, you know, hand it to the guy on a platter. And that's very attractive to young men who have been talked down to in churches for ages, to kind of feel like they have the freedom now to be direct and say, no, that's wrong, and I can have an opinion. It's not a crime to have an opinion. If you believe something, you should have an opinion. But they're being misled by a bunch of fraudsters and just immature twerps who have gathered these followers of guys and are now discipling them. And so the church is losing discipleship of young men because they're not willing to be direct. I mean, that's kind of what I've seen. Do you agree with that? Do you have any nuances on what you've seen?
Yeah, I would say for pastors who are finding that they've got these kind of young men that are coming to their church, visiting their church, my best advice that I've given people is that a lot of times some of the questions you might be getting are just test questions. Yes. And what they're testing to see is, will you be direct? Will you give a direct answer? And so they're looking to see, will you make the comment that has, you know, a million qualifications to it? Are you going to use this time to counter signal somebody else? right? Like,
oh, yes.
And so oftentimes I think pastors think, oh my gosh, like I need to make sure I say, all of these things. Really what they're just looking to see, will you say something direct? And so if they're like, hey, do you believe, I don't know, that, Christian or there's wives shouldn't, or women shouldn't be ordained elders. Like, you don't actually have to go into this very long thing. You can just be like, no, I don't.
No.
And leave it at that. Like, you don't
And
need
they
to
might ask you
counter-signal.
why you think that later, but
Yeah. Sometimes they're just
that's-
looking to see, like, what will you say? And like the crazy thing is like, they'll even things where they'll be like, do you believe women can never have a job outside the home? If you're just like, well, no, like there could be circumstances where that would be fine. Like if you just give a simple, straight answer, sometimes that's what they just want to hear is like, oh, like at least he's direct. At least he doesn't, hedge and qualify and blah, blah. I think that's kind of the first thing that I would say is, just being direct itself. It doesn't really matter what you're being direct about sometimes is just enough.
Yeah, straightforwardness and integrity go hand in hand. And so like online, it can seem like people who are the most frank are like the least have the least character, but like in a real world setting, a lot of the time integrity will make it so that you are more straightforward, like not in a weird way, but just like, yeah, this is what I think.
Yeah.
There's a difference between, and I think sometimes what Sarah and I have talked about in the past is there is this need to like be nice and qualify every statement so that we can get along with other people of the denomination, which is fine. Like there's nothing wrong with getting along, but there's a difference between straightforwardness and just frankness about disagreement. And you can do that with a good character and like just being nice and going along to get along. Like those are not the same thing. And I feel personally that more people would benefit from understanding that distinction. But it sounds like straightforwardness is something that you feel like would be very helpful in a church.
I think setting. So too. I think also like this is also something that I think I get from my upbringing. We would sit at the dinner table and we would talk about theology and we would talk about politics. And like you were kind of expected, like as my sister and I, like we were kind of expected to have an opinion and be able to like defend it. And you could have a conversation where me and my dad would like disagree on something about politics, but like you had to say your opinion and then you had to like get along. Like you had to learn how to disagree in love and in kindness with one another. I think a lot of times sometimes I think I get perceived maybe in conversations with, like at seminary or in classes where I kind of think maybe sometimes I'm being perceived as a jerk, but like I'm just like I like having a good debate. I like having conversations with people. And I think we need to like kind of lean into being like, okay, it's okay to like have a spirited debate between men and not have our feelings hurt. And we can walk away still, in arms, arm in arm about, in shared mission and what we're trying to do as a church or whatever. So I think that's part of it as well, as we kind of just need to lean into like being straightforward, being okay with disagreement, being able to debate one another as men. I think that's a big thing too.
And then I think when you have that, when the crazies come along and start being straightforward in absence of like character and integrity, then people will see like, oh, that's just a crazy person because
who invited this guy? Like,
like everyone I know, like the non-girl has made a Mean Girls reference. Let the
oh my goodness.
We get kind of a lot of flack on this podcast for laughing. So I just appreciate the Mean Girls reference. I like to have fun. I like to have a good time. All in the spirit of spirited debate, conversation. I think I really enjoy having discussions like this. It's just difficult when people don't have this idea of we're going to debate in a logical way. Like not a lot of people like we must have every proposition.
But you can't tie yourself. It is not a personal insult. If somebody disagrees with something that you are arguing for, it is a disagreement. It is an intellectual disagreement. And we have lost the difference between I disagree with your opinion and I hate your guts. It's like the two are inseparably tied, which is a great plug for parenting of do not let your kids emotionally manipulate you at the dining, like, I don't like that. Well, why? Like, I drag that out of my boys all the time. They're not allowed to tell me, I don't like that. That seems mean. I mean, I've gotten that a couple times.
Mhm.
I'm like, well, why? Tell me why. And, you work through it with them. When you've got parents, and my parents did a great job of this, when you've got parents who make you think through instead of feeling things, especially when you're in that middle school stage, that high school stage where your hormones are raging and you're an idiot and everything feels like it's the end of the world, when you've got adults and parents in your life who are guiding you through that. Yes, you have feelings, and I'm going to be as sympathetic as possible, but in the practical world, I don't care. It doesn't really have much bearing on what you think. It makes a huge difference as you bring up your kid. One thing I did want to catch before I forget about it with my tiny little pregnancy brain was, you said something about how young men are usually looking, and they ask test questions,
Mhm.
and they're looking for a direct answer. They're looking for, truth, and will you just come out and say it, sort of thing. But I find that they're also looking, when you said, they're seeing if you're going to counter signal any kind of movement. One of the things that I've seen absolutely botched is when you think, oh, this guy is asking this question because he believes X.
Right.
He's seen this sort of internet movement, whether it's a political ideology or it's a, worship in the church, or he's talking about, praise bands or singing psalms or whatever. And then the pastor or the elder, whoever he asks, immediately like bites his head off.
Right.
Like, oh, this is a thing that is not good. And so I'm going to show this little guy exactly why I think it's not good. And the pastor may be completely correct.
Right.
But what he's doing is addressing this young man in the most disrespectful, childlike manner. And it doesn't really even matter if the young man is disrespectful and childlike. I mean, if we think of the people that answered our questions patiently as we grew up as kids and into college, and young men and women as we all went through either cage stage or just different stages of idiocy, and the people who mentored us and were patient with us, those are the people that did the most good for our sanctification. People who immediately dismiss and immediately, that you can almost see these guys turn on a dime and be like, oh, bad thing, red lights, let's annihilate this.
Right.
I see a lot of younger guys.
Weird guy that I don't like, so I have to counter signal him for the rest of time.
And then you've lost this young man completely, because he's like, oh, well, you just treated me like an absolute child.
Yeah.
And you threw this whole thing that I'm interested in, even if it's just certain kinds of political ideologies that are in vogue right now, you're not asking him the question, you're getting offended by a hypothetical thought that he might have. And then you've lost him, because he's figuring out you're not even willing to have this conversation. You're flying off the handle. I can't have other conversations with you. Do you see that as well?
No, definitely. I think there's a lot of pressure because of social media, where there's a sort of like, okay, do I need to nip this in the bud and get this out of my church like immediely? There's that kind of mentality. Because it's like, well, if somebody finds out that this person is coming to my church, like I could get, these repercussions could come my way. I think in these kind of cases, I'm a huge fan of Mark's gospel. I teach it a lot. I use it a lot as when I teach my Sunday school classes. And I think in this case, we can see the model of Jesus and his discipleship of the 12 disciples. Think about all the times that one of the disciples or the 12 disciples totally get something wrong. They totally get Jesus's ministry wrong, right? And Jesus gives very clear, direct answers to them when they get wrong. Yeah. But he clearly did it in a way where they weren't like, well, I'm out of here, I'm going to leave. They kept wanting to follow him. So he clearly did it in a way that inspired them and cultivated this idea where they're going to continue along in the journey and in the discipleship. Jesus welcomed those questions. He answered them directly, but he also did it in a way where they felt like, okay, I can still be under this person. I can still listen to him. I can still be shepherded by him. I can still be discipled by him. I think that's kind of the model is, are we answering people's questions in a way where they still feel like, I want to be shepherded by this person. I want to be discipled by this person. I think that's a big thing when we think about the questions that we are getting from especially young men, where, you know, they don't quite get it. There's some things that need to be sanctified. There are some things that need to be changed. But realizing that can be a really slow process. And the question is, are you going to love those people, you know, through that process? I think a lot of times, and not to psychoanalyze everything, but like, I think a lot of times what people are really doing, they want to be accepted. They want to be welcome. They want to be a place where they're going to be known and loved. I mean, I think it can get kind of sappy, but I think that's true.
Yes.
And I think a lot of these movements, what they're really offering is they're offering an in crowd. You can be part of us. You can be in the in crowd. And I think that that's ultimately what people long for, what they really want. And so I think by showing people, like, look, this is what we believe. We believe that this is what you're saying is wrong, but we will still welcome you in here, and we will work with you, and we will disciple you and walk with you as you, and we're not going to abandon you. We're not going to throw you out. We're not going to call you out on Twitter. We're not going to, I think that just having that mentality and that framing your discipleship in that way will go a long way in sanctification.
Well, I think we saw that with the LGBTQ community. We see that now is still like this identity, especially for girls, young men too, but there was a lot of the trans community was girls, saying my identity is with these people and this is my group and these are who I belong with. And I see, I see the horseshoe effect, all the way on the other end, on the secular right, of the same sort of thing. I want, these are my people. These are the people I can be free with, whether or not that means that I probably should restrain my tongue. You know, we'll throw the book of James out the window for right now, but this is who the people I can talk with. And, you know, this is who I can be my authentic self with. And young men a lot of them, they're looking for belonging, but they're also looking for respect, which, I mean, respect is earned. Yes. But guys, mentors who are patient with them and don't immediately emasculate them upon the first question, you know, you're going to get farther with these guys. It's sanctification is a long process for all of us, especially when we're young and we're in, 19, 20, 21. It's a long process.
And especially for us, like when we think about our doctrines, like taking comfort in our doctrines, we can't force it. Like I can't, as a pastor, I can't force somebody through sanctification. That's the work of the Spirit. I'm here to just like administer the means and love them and disciple them. And so it's kind of like okay, Lord, you're taking longer than maybe I would have liked, but like, I'm going to trust you in this. I'm going to continue to have faith that you're working this thing just as you promised in your word, that you will bring it to completion. And so I think that's a big part of it, of realizing like, I can't really do this. Like, I think a lot of people treat these kind of cases where they're like, well, I can definitely get this person to change their mind. I can get them. I can move them.
Gosh, yeah.
Like, I don't think you're gonna be able to do it.
You're actually gonna do a worse job by coming off at it with that attitude. And just so I'm not always punching left, which I'm really good at doing, but just to, accept some reality here. Conservatives, especially in the PCA, conservatives have just gotten used to reacting against everything. We're whatever the controversy du jour is of the day, we're really good at analyzing it. We're really good at critiquing it and telling everybody how it's completely wrong in 17 different bullet points. I respect the ability to do that. But I think what we're seeing right now is there's starting to become a little bit of a gap in leadership. Yeah. And so you can't constantly play defense. You have to play offense. You have to lead. You have to be upfront. You cannot constantly be reacting against the latest thing, even though that's way easier to sit in your armchair and say, we're doing all this wrong. Well, okay, how do you propose we do it? Well, I don't know. That's not my forte, but I'm really good at critiquing. Okay, well, we have like 100 million of you. Can we have, we need something different. So how would you suggest, playing offense when have you noticed, as a young man growing up in the church, what did you notice about strong conservative leadership? Not just the critiquing, not just the, finagling over wording and stuff like that. What did you notice about strong conservative leadership, and what did that look like? What was admirable about it?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things. From a practical point of view, I think one thing that you can do to go on the offense is really emphasize networks. And what I mean by that is connecting people, especially young men, with older men that they can sort of sit under and grow from and learn from.
Yes.
I think when we have a sort of network mindset when it comes to leadership, I think what we end up doing is we identify people that have different gifts and different talents, and then we're able to sort of feed them into places where they can be successful and lead in where God has gifted them to lead. Mm-hmm. This might be a little bit controversial. I think one way that we play defense is anytime there's a young man that shows any gifting when it comes to, like, say, they're a good speaker, they've got ambition, they're a natural, the natural leader. We kind of do this thing where we go, okay, well, we need to get them into the church. Like, we need to get them working in the church. And we don't necessarily think, is that their calling? Is that what they've been called to do, is to be a minister? That may not be the case. They may be called to do something else, to be a leader in, say, a particular profession or a particular field. And as ministers, we support that and care for them and shepherd them while they're doing that. I think about, I wrote a piece one time for American Reformer because we were having our third son, and I was thinking about, oh my gosh, I've been given these 3 boys and now I have to raise them, and I don't really know what I'm doing, and like, what do I do here?
That's fair.
And
join the club.
And I thought about, like, what do I want for them, and what does God want for them? And I think, kind of selfishly, I'm like, well, if I want them to be like, I want them to be ministers. I want them to be in the church. I want them to be leading. Like, that's kind of what I think. But then, like, I look at my oldest son, who is very incredibly smart, has got leadership skills, and he loves the Army. And I've kind of like, well, maybe what his calling is to go be a leader in the Army and be a witness in those places. Mm-hmm. What I'm trying to say is that I think we often try to hoard the best for ministry, and we kind of think, well, if we get that, then we can sort of build this defense area around the church, and then we'll be able to, like, defend it, and we'll be able to, like, fight off any attacks. Mm-hmm. Really, what we need to be doing is, like, asking ourselves, is that person called to ordained ministry? If they're not, they can use these gifts and talents for something else, and our job as a pastor is to support them and to shepherd them along that. Like, you think about all these way back in the day when the main line was really big, right? Really before it kind of took its massive dip with bad theology. Mm-hmm. But, like, we had devout Protestants who were some of the first astronauts into space, who are reading Genesis from space. You think about that kind of stuff. Like, today, I think you see somebody that has that kind of skill and that kind of talent. You're like, well, we got to get them into ministry, like, get them into seminary. Like, I think that's just kind of a defensive mode. I think when we want to think about offense, networking and putting people who have, young men especially, who have these talents and these gifting, and putting them out to be leaders in other areas, and having the church be the support and shepherding arm of that. I think that's one thing. I think I'll make another sort of more pastoral answer. I think a lot of, we talked about sort of the right-wing pugilists, the people that we talk about. When I hear and read that stuff, a lot of it to me is resentment.
Yes.
I think conservative movements can often fall prey to resentment.
Absolutely.
And the idea is, well, I'm preaching Luke 15 this week, so I'm preaching the parable of the prodigal son, and I'm talking about the younger brother and the older brother, and Jesus uses the older brother really to call out the Pharisees. And what is he calling out in the Pharisees? What he's calling out really is resentment. The older brother says, "Lord, I have obeyed you. I've done everything that you told me to do, and you're not giving me what I want.
Where's my reward?"
Exactly. He's leveraging the law against God. And I think conservatives can sometimes fall prey to this. We can say, but God, I've kept the standards. I haven't wandered from the church. Like, you need to give me this stuff now.
Yes.
And, I think resentment will just poison your soul. Like, I think it'll destroy your soul. And so the best antidote to resentment, I think, is what Jesus talks about, is joy. Is joy in the Father. I mean, in the parables in Luke 15, everything ends with joy, 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 right? Like, it's all about joy in the Father, and realizing that relationship with God is the chief end of man. That's what we were made for. And so I think conservative movements can do a lot by witnessing that joy to people. And that's a way we can lead, is by being a joyful movement, by being a joyful group of people that will attract the right kind of people.
Yes.
And it will also repel the right kind of people.
It will repel the right kind of people. And it will inspire, the next big ideas, the next big, I think all of that, when you're in that kind of environment of joy and support and love for one another, that's when really awesome stuff happens. That's really where the Spirit is working, and you can see really cool ideas. I mean, I see a lot of some of the really exciting new podcasts and blogs that I see coming from some of the conservative guys, like in the GRN and things like that. I see a lot of that as a very joyful movement. I think about the movement for really working on DPW. I see that as a very sort of joyfully led movement of guys, this is think about what worship could be. And I just think that that's a really cool way of doing that. And then obviously being on the offensive there, not necessarily playing defense.
Yeah. So we've got about 5 minutes before we have to exit the studio. And I wanted to ask you one last question to wrap up. This has been great. Okay, so for the young men who are listening to this, if there are any who are not asleep by now, what would you say to the young men who are in the Protestant church, but who are frustrated?
Maybe even in the PCA who are frustrated.
Who are feeling that inclination towards resentment, who may be in sort of a flaky-ish, wishy-washy church, and they're trying to be good church members, and they're trying to be faithful congregants, and they're just frustrated. They just feel like they're hitting a wall. And they're getting angrier and angrier. Okay. I think we've got a lot of that. There's a lot of that. What would you say to them?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I think certainly I would want to reemphasize the stuff about resentment and how it will destroy your soul. There's just no other way around it. That's exactly what Jesus is saying, I think. I think one way you can kind of kill the resentment in your soul is by being somebody that is quick to forgive, patient, and then also connecting with people that make it so you don't feel embattled all the time. Yes. I think it's really easy for somebody who's say very confessional. Maybe you find yourself in a church that's not. You can feel it can become very quickly to feel like I'm alone, and I'm alone in this fight, and I'm all on my own. And the reality is that you're not. There's tons of people out there who feel very, very similar to you, but you got to go out and find them. And I think that's a big thing. And so look for those people and try and get yourself plugged into those networks. And yeah, the constant feeling of being embattled is not going to be good for you. And it's going
Right.
to lead into some bad places. And so you need to find those people that make you feel like you're not. I think I'll also say this. I was thinking about this question a lot, and I was trying to think, okay, I can say all this like pastoral stuff and this like sort of like touchy-feely stuff. What's something like really practical? What's something really practical? And this is what I came up with. So you guys can tell me if I'm crazy here. My practical advice is, whether you have kids or not, whether you're married or not, get involved in the kids ministry in your church.
Yes.
I was like I said, I talked about Mark, and I was reading in Mark, and I think about this passage from Mark 10, right? This is verse 13, and you know, this is the let the children come to me. Jesus says, and they were bringing children to him that he might touch them, and the disciples rebuked them. But when Jesus saw it, he was indignant and said to them, let the children come to me. Do not hinder them, for to such belongs the kingdom of God. I think kids ministry, working with children, there is a way that it softens your heart.
Mm-hmm.
And if you want to understand the kingdom of God, you have to understand kids. And you have to be able to like spending time with kids, and kids have to like spending time with you. And I think that there's a way it softens our hearts to a lot of these things that we sort of feel embattled and this constant pressure on, things that kids don't feel, right? Things that kids don't even give a second mind to. And I think there's something really beautiful about it. When I first started in ministry, being brand new in ministry, you get thrown into kids ministry. That's just tends what happened.
Youth and families.
Yep. Yeah.
Yep.
And, you know, I had been leading Bible studies on Capitol Hill, like with people that worked in big time offices. And I'm like, now I'm teaching middle school and high school Sunday school class. But there is something like really beautiful about it. And it really does like soften your soul to the beauty of the gospel. And like, you learn all these things about yourself, teaching kids. And there's this thing where it's like, you'll be talking with like a middle schooler, and, you know, to them, their life is falling apart because like somebody didn't want to go to the dance with them or something like that. And you're sitting there being like, you have no idea, like, this is not a big deal at all. And then you realize like, this is exactly what the relationship between me and God the Father is like.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I think all about these things in my life, and they're, oh, my people aren't holding to the standards and blah, blah, blah. And the Father's just like, I've got you. Like, it's going to be okay.
Yeah.
I just think that if you get involved in kids ministry, you'll learn something about the kingdom of God. It'll soften your heart. And I think more than anything, young men, especially in churches where they feel like I'm fighting a constant spiritual battle, I think what they need sometimes is to have their heart softened and to experience the beauty of the gospel. That's kind of like a very, you know, all over the place kind of thing. But I was thinking about something really practical that you could give. I
don't think that's crazy at all. I think that is actually spot on. So, yeah, soften your hearts. That's a lesson for all of us. Zoe, I know we have to get out of here real quick, so I will let you do the outro, and we will sign off. Thank you all so much for listening. Thank you, Robert, for coming on and being very free and being frank with us. And yeah, letting us be the arbiters of what is crazy. That was a slight dangerous move, but we appreciate it. Thank you.
Absolutely. I definitely echo all of that. I think it's really great that we talked about just the life and ordinary ministry for you growing up, but also just how that connects to, you know, having confidence, having faith in our standards. There's just so much that applies to itself in this context. So we really appreciate you for coming on. In my opinion, being ashamed of your own tradition and constantly sidestepping it and then wondering why nobody wants to join you is kind of like failing an open note test. So that's just my opinion. You know, what we've seen from Robert and others is that I feel like these ordinary acts of faithfulness have long-term consequences. And what you do today, just in your ordinary life, can and will shape the future of the church landscape. So, you know, normal faithfulness is very boring, but we certainly appreciate it. And so thank you, Robert, and we will catch you next time.
Thank you all.
Where's the Holy Ghost salvation? The Holy Ghost